I never thought a pile of snow would land me in court, but that's exactly what happened when Patricia from the HOA decided my driveway was her personal vendetta. It started on a frigid January morning in Burlington, Vermont, when I woke up to find 18 inches of fresh powder blanketing everything in sight. I'm Peterson, a software developer who moved to this supposedly quiet neighborhood 3 years ago, and I'd learned pretty quickly that our HOA president, Patricia Henderson, ran the Pine Ridge Community Association like her own personal fiefdom. She was one of those women who turned enforcing minor rules into a full-time occupation, complete with a 3-ring binder of violations she'd photographed over the years. Her blonde hair was always styled in that exact Karen cut. You know the one, shorter in the back and longer in the front. And she drove a white Lexus SUV with a bumper sticker that read, "I speak to managers." That morning, I'd been up since 5 in the morning with my snowblower, clearing out my driveway before the sun even considered rising. My property sat on a corner lot, which meant I had more frontage to clear than most of my neighbors, but I didn't mind the extra work. I actually enjoyed the peaceful solitude of early morning snow removal, watching my breath fog in the cold air while the machine rumbled and threw snow in high arcs. I'd developed a system over the years, one that was efficient and kept my driveway completely clear while creating a neat snowbank along the property line. Here's the thing about my snowbank: it sat entirely on my property. I'd had a surveyor come out the previous spring after Patricia had complained about my fence being potentially encroaching on HOA common area. Turned out my fence was a full 3 feet inside my property line, and I'd kept that survey report in my files ever since. So when I piled snow along that same line, I knew exactly where my property ended and the street began. The snowbank was a good 4 feet high, dense and packed from the snowblower's force, sitting like a white wall between my driveway and the road. I just finished up around 7 in the morning, my fingers numb despite the insulated gloves, when I noticed Patricia's Lexus cruising slowly down the street. She did this sometimes, patrolling the neighborhood like some kind of suburban sheriff, looking for violations. Dead grass, violation. Christmas lights still up past January 5th, violation. Kids' toys visible from the street. You better believe that was a violation. I'd received my share of her notices over the years, mostly petty things that I'd contested, and one, which only seemed to make her more determined to find something that would stick. I gave her a polite wave as she passed, and she stared at me with that pinched expression she always wore, like she'd just bitten into a lemon. Her window rolled down despite the cold, and she leaned out slightly. "That snowbank is unsightly," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority she loved to use. "It needs to be spread out more evenly. It's creating an eyesore for the community." I walked closer to the street, still holding the snowblower's handle. "Morning, Patricia. The snow is entirely on my property, and the HOA covenants don't specify how snow removal should be aesthetically arranged. I checked last time you complained about my lawn care." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll be reviewing the bylaws. I'm certain we have provisions about maintaining curb appeal even in winter months." "You do that," I replied, keeping my tone friendly but firm. "I'll be inside warming up. Have a good day." I didn't wait for her response, just turned and guided the snowblower back to my garage. Through my kitchen window a few minutes later, I watched her car sit at the stop sign at the end of our street for an unusually long time before she finally drove off. I should have known then that she was plotting something, but I was more focused on the hot coffee I was brewing and the remote work I needed to get done. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I logged into my computer, attended a few virtual meetings, wrote some code, and generally forgot about Patricia and her snow complaints. The temperature stayed below freezing, which meant the snowbank remained solid and intact. By evening, the setting sun cast long blue shadows across the white landscape, and the neighborhood looked like something from a postcard. It was around 8 at night when I heard the crash. I'd been sitting in my living room, half watching a documentary about Antarctic exploration, when a tremendous bang rattled my windows. It sounded like someone had dropped a car from a crane. I jumped up, my heart racing, and ran to the front window. What I saw made me stop in my tracks. Patricia's white Lexus was buried nose first in my snowbank, the rear end sticking up at an angle with the back wheels still on the road. The impact had been hard enough that snow had exploded over the hood and windshield, and the front bumper was clearly crumpled. The airbags had deployed. I could see the deflated white bags through the windshield, and steam was rising from the front of the vehicle. I grabbed my phone and coat and rushed outside. Despite my issues with Patricia, I wasn't about to leave someone potentially injured in a crashed vehicle. The cold hit me like a slap, and my boots crunched through the snow as I ran to the street. "Patricia, are you okay?" I shouted, approaching the driver's side. The door opened with some difficulty, scraping against compacted snow, and Patricia climbed out. Her face was red, and there was a small cut on her forehead where she must have hit something despite the airbag, but she seemed otherwise physically intact. What surprised me was that she didn't seem disoriented or shocked. She seemed angry. "Your snowbank," she shouted, pointing at the pile of snow her car was embedded in. "You created a hazard. This is your fault." I stood there, genuinely confused. "Patricia, are you hurt? Should I call an ambulance?" "I don't need an ambulance. I need you to take responsibility for this dangerous condition you've created." By now, several neighbors had emerged from their houses, drawn by the noise. Dave Morrison from across the street jogged over in his slippers, and elderly Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down shuffled out in her bathrobe. "What happened?" Dave asked, looking at the crashed SUV with wide eyes. "She hit my snowbank," I explained, still trying to process what was happening. "I was inside and heard the crash." "He created a hazard," Patricia insisted, her voice rising. "That snowbank is a danger to drivers, and now look what happened. My car is totaled." I looked at the Lexus more carefully. The front end was definitely damaged, but totaled seemed like an exaggeration. More importantly, I couldn't understand how she'd managed to hit a snowbank that was completely off the road. My driveway was on a straight section of street with excellent visibility. There was no ice, no reason for a car to suddenly veer off the road and into my property. "Patricia, the snowbank is on my property," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's not in the street. How did you hit it?" Her eyes narrowed. "The glare from the snow blinded me. It's a distraction and a hazard. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." That's when something clicked in my mind. The long pause at the stop sign that morning, the way she'd been driving slowly past my house. Patricia hadn't accidentally hit my snowbank. She'd done it on purpose. "Let me call the police," I said, pulling out my phone. "We need to file an accident report." "No need," Patricia said quickly. "This is a private property matter. I'll be handling this through my insurance and my attorney." Dave frowned. "Patricia, if you're claiming injury or damages, you really should have a police report. That's pretty standard." "I know what I'm doing," she snapped. "I've already taken photos." She held up her phone, showing she'd apparently been photographing the scene even while sitting in her crashed car. Mrs. Chen shook her head slowly. "Dear, that snowbank has been there all day. I walked past it this afternoon. It's clearly on Aaron's property." "I know what I experienced," Patricia insisted. She turned to me, and there was something almost triumphant in her expression. "You've been a problem for this HOA ever since you moved here, Aaron. Always questioning, always pushing back against community standards. Well, now you've created an actual hazard and you're going to pay for it." I felt a cold anger settling in my gut, separate from the January chill. "I'm calling the police anyway. This is an accident scene and I want it properly documented." Patricia's face flushed darker. "Fine, call them. My lawyer will be contacting you regardless." The Burlington Police Department sent an officer within 20 minutes. Officer James Kowalski was a stocky guy in his 40s who'd probably seen every kind of winter accident imaginable. He took statements from all of us, measured the scene, and took his own photographs. I noticed him paying particular attention to the snowbank's position relative to the road. "Madam, can you explain how your vehicle left the roadway?" he asked Patricia, his pen poised over his notepad. "The snow created a glare and distraction," Patricia said. "It's piled dangerously high and caused me to lose control of my vehicle." Officer Kowalski looked at the clear, dry road surface. "Were you experiencing any mechanical issues with your vehicle? Brake failure, steering problems?" "No, nothing like that." "And you weren't avoiding another vehicle or obstacle?" "No." He wrote some more notes, then walked the length of my property line, examining the snowbank. When he came back, he addressed both of us. "Mr. Peterson, is this snow entirely on your property?" "Yes, officer. I have a recent survey if you need to verify the property line." "That won't be necessary right now. The snowbank is clearly several feet from the road surface." He turned to Patricia. "Miss Henderson, I'm not finding any evidence that this snowbank created a hazardous condition. It's not blocking sightlines, it's not on the roadway, and the street conditions are clear. I'm going to have to cite you for failure to maintain control of your vehicle." Patricia's mouth fell open. "Excuse me? I'm the victim here." "Madam, your vehicle left the roadway and struck an object on private property. Based on the physical evidence and your statement, this appears to be driver error. You're receiving a citation." I almost felt bad for her as Officer Kowalski wrote out the ticket, but only almost. Patricia snatched it from his hand with barely controlled fury, and I could see her hand shaking. "This isn't over," she said to me, ignoring the officer. "Not by a long shot." A tow truck arrived shortly after to extract the Lexus from my snowbank. The process took nearly an hour, with the driver having to winch the SUV backward carefully to avoid causing more damage. Patricia sat in Mrs. Chen's living room during the extraction, refusing to wait in the cold, but also refusing to leave the scene. When the Lexus was finally loaded onto the flatbed, its front end looked even worse than I'd initially thought. The bumper hung at an angle, one headlight was completely shattered, and fluid dripped onto the snow. After everyone had left and my quiet street returned to its normal evening calm, I stood in my driveway looking at the damaged snowbank. There was a car-shaped crater in it now, with chunks of snow scattered across my lawn and driveway. I'd have to clean it up in the morning, but right then, I was too tired and too wired from adrenaline to do anything but go inside and try to process what had just happened. I texted my brother Marcus, who lived in Boston. He was a paralegal and always had good advice for legal situations. "You're not going to believe this," I typed, and then gave him the whole story. His response came quickly. "Please tell me you have cameras." I stopped mid-step on my way to the kitchen. Cameras. I'd installed a Ring doorbell 6 months ago after a package theft in the neighborhood, and I'd added 2 more exterior cameras as part of the same system. One pointed at my driveway and front yard. The other covered the side yard and street. My hands were shaking slightly as I pulled up the app on my phone. I navigated to the evening's footage and found the timestamp for the crash. The driveway camera had a perfect view of the street and my snowbank. What I saw on that video made my jaw drop. The footage showed Patricia's Lexus approaching slowly from the north, moving at maybe 10 miles per hour. The street was well lit by streetlights, and visibility was clearly excellent. The SUV continued past my driveway, then stopped. Brake lights glowed red in the darkness. Then, after a pause of maybe 5 seconds, the vehicle reversed slightly, turned the wheels toward my property, and accelerated directly into the snowbank. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a glare or a distraction. Patricia had deliberately crashed her own car into my snowbank. I watched the video 3 more times, unable to believe what I was seeing. She'd committed what amounted to insurance fraud, property damage, and was planning to sue me for it. The premeditation of it was staggering. She'd actually crashed her own expensive vehicle just to create a case against me. "Marcus," I texted. "I have video. She did it on purpose. Download that footage immediately. Save it to multiple places. Cloud storage, external drive, everything. And don't tell anyone you have it yet." I followed his advice, spending the next hour backing up the footage to every storage solution I could think of. I emailed it to myself, uploaded it to 3 different cloud services, and saved it to a USB drive that I locked in my fire safe. Only after I'd secured the evidence did I allow myself to relax slightly. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about Patricia's face when the officer had given her the citation, that mixture of shock and rage. She'd expected this to go differently. She'd probably imagined me panicking, immediately offering to pay for damages, maybe even being forced to move due to the liability. Instead, she'd gotten a ticket and was facing her own insurance deductible. But she'd also said her lawyer would be contacting me. That part hadn't been a bluff. Sure enough, 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the law office of Whitmore and Associates. The letter, written in dense legal language, informed me that Patricia Henderson was pursuing a civil claim for damages related to the hazardous condition I'd created on my property. The letter demanded I contact my homeowner's insurance immediately, and warned that failure to respond appropriately would result in a lawsuit. The claimed damages made my eyes water. Patricia was seeking $50,000 for vehicle damage, medical expenses, pain and suffering, lost wages, and emotional distress. $50,000 for a crash she'd caused herself on purpose. I called my insurance company that afternoon. The claims adjuster, a woman named Sandra who sounded like she'd heard everything in her career, listened patiently to my explanation. "And you have video of the incident?" she asked. "Yes, from multiple angles. It clearly shows her deliberately driving into the snowbank." There was a pause. "Mr. Peterson, are you telling me you have evidence that Miss Henderson intentionally caused this collision?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. I'm going to need you to upload that footage to our secure portal immediately. This changes everything about how we'll handle this claim." I spent another hour uploading the footage and writing a detailed statement. Sandra called me back the next day. "Mr. Peterson, we've reviewed the video. You're right, this appears to be an intentional act. We're denying the claim entirely and flagging this for potential fraud investigation. However, I need to warn you that Miss Henderson can still choose to pursue this through civil court. If she does, we'll provide you with legal representation as part of your policy coverage." "She's definitely going to sue," I said. "She's not the type to back down." "Then we'll see her in court. Make sure you keep that video safe." I thought maybe, just maybe, once Patricia's lawyer saw the police report and my insurance company's denial, they'd convince her to drop this ridiculous claim. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, I was served with a lawsuit. A process server showed up at my door on a Saturday morning, handed me a thick stack of papers, and got my signature confirming receipt. The complaint was even more extensive than the demand letter. Patricia was now claiming $75,000 in damages and had added allegations that I'd been negligent and reckless in my snow removal, that I'd created an attractive nuisance, and that I'd shown a pattern of disregard for community safety standards. The attractive nuisance claim was particularly absurd. That legal doctrine usually applied to things like unfenced pools that might attract children. Patricia was arguing that my snowbank was so unusually large and eye-catching that it naturally drew attention away from the road. It was creative, I'd give her that, but it was also complete nonsense. My insurance company assigned me an attorney named Robert Fisher. He was a litigation specialist in his late 50s with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd seen every courtroom trick in the book. We met at his office in downtown Burlington, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Champlain. "I've reviewed everything," Robert said, spreading the documents across his conference table. "The police report, the video footage, the insurance denial, all of it. Mr. Peterson, I'm going to be direct with you. This is the most clear-cut case of fraud I've seen in a decade. But here's what's going to happen. We're going to let this go through the discovery process. Miss Henderson is going to have to sit for a deposition. She's going to have to answer questions under oath. And then we're going to file a motion for summary judgment and we're going to show that video to the judge." "Can't we just show the video now and get this dismissed?" I asked. Robert smiled slightly. "We could, but here's the thing. If Miss Henderson wants to commit perjury by lying under oath about what happened, that's additional evidence for potential criminal charges. And if she withdraws the suit now, she could claim she simply made a mistake in her recollection. Let her dig herself deeper first." It was strategic, but it also meant months of stress. The lawsuit hung over my head like a dark cloud as winter transitioned into spring. Patricia had apparently stepped back from her HOA duties, citing stress and recovery from her accident, but she'd installed her friend Deborah as interim president. Deborah was younger than Patricia, maybe in her early 40s, but just as zealous about enforcement. I started receiving violation notices again. My grass was allegedly too long, even though it was measured at exactly the permitted height. My recycling bin was supposedly visible from the street, even though it was in my garage. One notice claimed I was operating a business from my home because I worked remotely, which violated the covenants. I responded to each one with detailed refutations and photos, but the harassment was clearly orchestrated. Meanwhile, the legal process ground forward. Discovery began, which meant both sides exchanged documents and evidence. Patricia's lawyer requested all sorts of materials: my property survey, my homeowner's insurance policy, records of any previous complaints, photographs of my property from the past year. I provided everything truthfully and completely. Our side requested Patricia's medical records, her insurance claim documents, her phone records from the day of the incident, and any communications she'd had about my property or the snowbank. This was where things got interesting. Robert called me in April with an update. "You're not going to believe this. Patricia's phone records show she called her insurance company 45 minutes before the crash. The call lasted 12 minutes. She also searched online for creating attractive nuisance and homeowner liability snow removal on her phone that afternoon. She was researching how to build a case before she even crashed her car," I said, amazed at the level of premeditation. "It gets better. Her medical records show she refused transport to the hospital and declined follow-up care. The only treatment she received was 2 Tylenol and a bandage at an urgent care clinic the next day. Yet she's claiming $5,000 in medical expenses and ongoing pain. What about her insurance claim? She told her insurance company the same story she told the police initially. That glare from the snow caused her to lose control. But her insurance company also denied the claim because the police report indicated driver error, and the physical evidence didn't support her version of events. So she got nothing from them either. The case was scheduled for trial in August, which meant I had several more months of waiting. The stress was affecting my work, my sleep, and my general quality of life. I'd never been sued before, and even though I knew I was in the right, the uncertainty was exhausting. Patricia and I hadn't spoken directly since the night of the crash, but I saw her around the neighborhood occasionally. She'd gotten a new car, another Lexus SUV, this one silver instead of white. Whenever she drove past my house, she'd slow down and stare, making sure I saw her looking. It was intimidation, plain and simple, and it pissed me off. In June, Patricia's deposition was scheduled. Robert invited me to attend, though I'd mostly be observing. The deposition took place in a bland conference room at Whitmore and Associates' office. Patricia arrived with her lawyer, Martin Whitmore himself, a thin man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually disapproving expression. Robert conducted the deposition with surgical precision. After establishing Patricia's background and her role as HOA president, he moved to the night of the crash. Miss Henderson, please describe in your own words what happened on the evening of January 7th. Patricia sat up straighter. She was dressed in a conservative navy suit, and there was no visible sign of any injury from the crash 5 months earlier. I was driving home from a community meeting. As I approached Mr. Peterson's property, I was momentarily blinded by the glare from his excessive snowbank. It was piled dangerously high and reflected the streetlight directly into my eyes. I lost control of my vehicle and crashed. "You lost control," Robert repeated. "Can you describe what you mean by that? Did your brakes fail?" "No, I just couldn't see where I was going." "But you were able to see well enough to know you were approaching Mr. Peterson's property specifically?" Patricia hesitated. "I knew where I was on the street, yes." "And you'd driven past this same snowbank earlier that day, had you not?" "I don't recall." Robert slid a photograph across the table. "This is a still image from Mr. Peterson's security camera showing your vehicle passing his house at approximately 7:15 that morning. Do you recall this?" Patricia barely glanced at it. "If you say so." "You stopped and spoke to Mr. Peterson that morning, didn't you?" "I may have." "And you complained about his snowbank, correct?" Martin Whitmore interjected. "I'm not sure the relevance of conversations from earlier in the day." Robert didn't even look at him. "I'm establishing Miss Henderson's familiarity with the allegedly hazardous condition." "Miss Henderson, yes or no, did you complain to Mr. Peterson about his snowbank that morning?" "I mentioned that it was unsightly." "So you were aware of its location and appearance well before the alleged incident that evening?" "I suppose." Robert pulled out another document. "Miss Henderson, I have here your phone records from January 7th. They show a 12-minute call to your insurance company at 6:47 in the evening. The crash occurred at approximately 8:05. "What were you calling your insurance company about?" Patricia's face paled slightly. "I don't remember. I call them about various things." "You don't remember a 12-minute conversation that occurred less than 90 minutes before you crashed your car?" "I speak with them regularly about my policies." "Your phone records also show several Google searches that afternoon. I'd like to ask you about those." Robert read from a printout. "At 4:32, you searched for homeowner liability snow. At 4:48, you searched for suing neighbor for property damage. At 5:15, you searched for attractive nuisance doctrine Vermont. You recall these searches. Martin held up a hand. Let's take a break. We just started, Robert said mildly. My client needs a moment. They huddled in the corner of the conference room, whispering urgently. Patricia's face had gone from pale to flushed, and her hands were clenched into fists. When they returned to the table, Martin's expression was grim. My client declines to answer questions about her phone usage. She's invoking her Fifth Amendment right, Robert asked, not bothering to hide his surprise. We're simply declining to answer at this time. The deposition continued for another hour, but Patricia's answers became increasingly evasive. She couldn't explain why she'd turned her wheel toward the snowbank if she'd been blinded by glare. She couldn't explain why she'd been traveling so slowly. She couldn't explain why she'd refused to let me call the police initially. By the end, even Martin looked uncomfortable with his client's testimony. Robert and I walked to his car afterward, and he was practically beaming. That was even better than I hoped. She basically admitted she can't explain her actions without incriminating herself. The Fifth Amendment claim about the phone records is particularly damning. You can't claim Fifth Amendment protection in a civil case unless you have reason to believe your answer might expose you to criminal liability. So, what happens now? I asked. Now we file our motion for summary judgment. We're going to include the video, the deposition transcript, the phone records, all of it. And we're going to ask the judge to not only dismiss this lawsuit, but to sanction Ms. Henderson for filing a frivolous claim. The motion was filed 2 weeks later. Robert crafted a devastating brief that laid out the entire timeline of Patricia's actions. From her morning complaint about the snowbank, to her afternoon research about liability, to her suspicious call to her insurance company, to the crash itself. The video was attached as Exhibit A, along with enhanced stills showing Patricia's brake lights, her reversed movement, and the deliberate turning of her wheels toward my property. The hearing was scheduled for late July. Vermont was in the full bloom of summer by then, green and lush, and it felt surreal to be fighting about a snowbank in 80-degree weather. The Chittenden County Superior Court was an imposing building in downtown Burlington, all classical columns and marble steps. I met Robert outside, wearing the only suit I owned, my palms sweating despite the professional dry cleaning. "Remember, you probably won't need to testify today," Robert said as we climbed the steps. "This is just argument on our motion, but be prepared in case the judge wants to hear from you." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected from watching legal dramas on television. Judge Catherine Morrison presided, a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Patricia sat at the plaintiff's table with Martin Whitmore, and I couldn't help but notice how uncomfortable she looked. Judge Morrison called the case. "This is Peterson versus Henderson. We're here on defendant's motion for summary judgment. Mr. Fisher, you may proceed." Robert stood, and for the next 20 minutes, he methodically destroyed Patricia's case. He walked through the evidence, the police report showing no hazardous road conditions, the survey proving the snowbank was entirely on my property, the denial of Patricia's insurance claim. Then he got to the video. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to play the security footage from the night in question." The judge nodded, and the bailiff set up a laptop and screen. The courtroom fell silent as the video played. You could hear Patricia's sharp intake of breath as her own Lexus appeared on screen, driving slowly, stopping, reversing, and then accelerating into the snowbank. When it finished, Judge Morrison was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Play that again." Robert did. This time, the judge asked him to pause at several points. when Patricia's brake lights showed she'd stopped when the reverse lights came on when the wheels turned. "Miss Henderson," Judge Morrison said, looking directly at Patricia. "That's your vehicle." Patricia stood shakily. "Yes, Your Honor, and you were the driver that evening." "Yes, but the video doesn't show. It shows exactly what it shows," the judge interrupted. "Mr. Whitmore, does your client have any explanation for this footage?" Martin stood, and I almost felt sorry for him. "Your Honor, we would argue that the video doesn't capture Miss Henderson's perspective from inside the vehicle. The glare she experienced, Counselor, I watched that video twice. The visibility was excellent. The street was well lit. Your client stopped her vehicle, deliberately reversed, turned toward the snowbank and accelerated into it. This court has seen a lot of questionable claims, but this may be the most flagrant attempt at fraud I've witnessed in my 20 years on the bench." Patricia made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "Miss Henderson, you filed a lawsuit claiming Mr. Peterson created a hazardous condition when in fact you deliberately drove your vehicle off the road and onto his property. You claimed damages for injuries that appear to be minimal at best. You filed false insurance claims, and when confronted with evidence of your actions, you invoked your Fifth Amendment rights rather than explain yourself." "Your Honor, I can explain," Patricia started. "I don't want to hear it. Here's what's going to happen. This lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice, meaning you cannot refile it. Mr. Peterson is awarded his costs and attorney's fees. Furthermore, I'm sanctioning you in the amount of $10,000 for filing a frivolous lawsuit. And I'm referring this matter to the Vermont Attorney General's office for investigation of insurance fraud." The courtroom was dead silent. Patricia was crying now, her shoulders shaking, and Martin had his hand on her arm as if to keep her from collapsing. "Your Honor," Martin said quietly, "my client has been under significant stress as president of her homeowners association. Perhaps some leniency. Mr. Whitmore, your client committed fraud and then attempted to profit from it by suing the very person whose property she damaged. There will be no leniency. If the Attorney General pursues criminal charges, Miss Henderson will have to answer for those separately." Judge Morrison looked at me. "Mr. Peterson, I apologize that you were put through this ordeal. The court finds absolutely no merit to the plaintiff's claims and commends you for thoroughly documenting the incident. It was over. Just like that, months of stress and worry ended with a judge's ruling." Robert shook my hand and we left the courtroom while Patricia and Martin huddled at their table. In the hallway outside, Robert was all smiles. "That went even better than I expected. Not only did we win, but she's facing potential criminal charges. The $10,000 sanction will come directly out of her pocket, and you'll be reimbursed for every penny you spent on this case." "What about the Attorney General investigation?" I asked. "That's out of our hands now, but based on the evidence, I'd say Miss Henderson is looking at serious legal trouble. Insurance fraud is a felony in Vermont. She could face fines, probation, possibly even jail time." We walked out of the courthouse into the bright summer afternoon. I felt like I could breathe fully for the first time in months. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How'd it go?" I typed back. "Total victory. Tell you everything tonight." The story should have ended there, but there was one more act to play out. 2 weeks after the hearing, I was working from home when I saw 2 Vermont State Police vehicles pull up to Patricia's house across the street. I watched through my window as 2 plainclothes detectives knocked on her door. Patricia answered, still in her bathrobe even though it was early afternoon, and I saw her face crumble when they showed her their badges. They were inside for about 30 minutes. When they emerged, Patricia was with them, dressed now but in handcuffs. They loaded her into one of the unmarked cars and drove away. Within an hour, the neighborhood was buzzing. Deborah, the interim HOA president, called an emergency meeting. Mrs. Chen texted me asking what had happened. Dave Morrison knocked on my door wanting to know if the arrest was related to the lawsuit. I learned later that Patricia had been charged with insurance fraud and filing a false police report. The investigation had uncovered that she'd made similar suspicious claims in the past, including a slip and fall at a grocery store 3 years earlier, where video evidence had contradicted her account. The Attorney General's office had built a case showing a pattern of fraudulent behavior. Patricia's arrest created chaos in the Pine Ridge Community Association. An emergency election was held, and the homeowners voted in a new board of directors, who immediately set about reforming the HOA's practices. The new president, a reasonable man named Tom who worked as an accountant, reached out to me personally to apologize for the harassment I'd endured. "A lot of us knew Patricia was over the top," Tom said when we met for coffee in August, "but nobody wanted to be the one to challenge her. She'd find a way to make your life miserable. I'm sorry we let it get so bad." "It's not your fault," I said, and I meant it, "but I appreciate the changes you're making." The new board suspended enforcement of petty violations and instead focused on genuine community concerns like street maintenance and snow removal. Ironically enough, they also implemented a formal appeals process for any violations and required photographic evidence with specific citations to the relevant covenant provisions. Patricia's criminal case moved through the system over the following months. In October, she accepted a plea deal rather than go to trial. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of insurance fraud and 1 count of filing a false report. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, ordered to pay $25,000 in restitution to her insurance company, and required to complete 300 hours of community service. She also had to pay the $10,000 sanction to me and reimburse all my attorney's fees, which came to another $15,000. The financial and legal consequences were severe enough, but the social consequences were perhaps worse for someone like Patricia. She became a pariah in the neighborhood. People who'd once feared her now openly mocked her. The story spread through Burlington's suburban communities, and she became known as the woman who crashed her own car. She put her house on the market in November and moved away before Christmas, though I heard through the neighborhood gossip that she'd taken a significant loss on the sale. As for me, I finally felt like I could enjoy my home without constantly looking over my shoulder. That first major snowfall of the following winter, I was actually excited to get out there with my snowblower. I cleared my driveway using the same pattern I always had, piling the snow in a neat bank along my property line. This time, though, I did something a little different. I installed a small sign at the edge of my property. It read, "Snowbank, please do not crash into it." Dave Morrison laughed so hard when he saw it that he had to lean against his mailbox. Mrs. Chen took a picture and posted it to the neighborhood Facebook group, where it got over 200 likes. Even Tom, the new HOA president, sent me a text with a laughing emoji. The sign stayed up all winter, a small monument to the absurdity of what had happened. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of how quickly things can escalate when someone lets petty grievances and a desire for control overtake common sense. Patricia had been so focused on finding a way to punish me for not bending to her authority that she destroyed her own life in the process. I thought about her sometimes, wondered where she'd ended up and whether she'd learned anything from the experience. Probably not, if I was being honest. People like Patricia rarely engaged in genuine self-reflection. She'd probably convinced herself that she was the victim, that somehow I'd trapped her or set her up. The mental gymnastics required to maintain that worldview were impressive in their own way. My brother Marcus came to visit that winter, and I gave him the full tour of the property, including a detailed walkthrough of where everything had happened. We stood in my driveway on a cold February afternoon, looking at the snowbank that had started it all. "You know what's crazy," Marcus said, his breath fogging in the air. "If she'd just left you alone, none of this would have happened. You would have kept doing your thing, she would have kept running the HOA into the ground, and life would have gone on." "But she couldn't leave it alone," I said. "That's the thing about people like Patricia. They see someone who won't submit to their authority and it becomes personal. It becomes about winning at any cost." Well, the cost turned out to be pretty high. We went inside for hot chocolate, and Marcus flew back to Boston the next day. Life settled into a comfortable routine after that. I worked. I maintained my property. I engaged with my neighbors in a friendly but boundaried way. The HOA became something that existed in the background of my life, rather than a constant source of stress. The following spring, I finally got around to doing the landscaping project I'd been planning for years. I installed new flower beds along the front of the house and put in a small water feature near the driveway. Everything was tasteful. Everything complied with the HOA covenants, and nobody gave me grief about any of it. It was amazing how much more enjoyable homeownership was when you weren't constantly under a microscope. One warm evening in May, I was sitting on my front porch reading a book when a familiar silver Lexus pulled up to the curb. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought Patricia had returned. But when the driver's door opened, it was Martin Whitmore who emerged. I set down my book and walked to the edge of the porch. "Mr. Whitmore, this is unexpected." He looked uncomfortable, holding a manila envelope. "Mr. Peterson, I wanted to apologize in person. I should have investigated my client's claims more thoroughly before filing that lawsuit. It was my responsibility to ensure the case had merit, and I failed in that duty." I studied him for a moment. "You're here on your own. Patricia didn't send you." "God, no. Patricia and I haven't spoken since the sentencing. I'm here because I needed to say this. What happened was unconscionable, and while my client bears primary responsibility, I should have caught it. I'm truly sorry for the stress and expense you endured." He handed me the envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. "What's this for?" I asked. "It's my personal contribution toward making this right. I know you were reimbursed for your legal fees, but that doesn't account for the time, stress, and energy you invested. Please accept it." I looked at the check, then at Martin. He seemed to have aged since the trial, new lines around his eyes and more gray in his hair. "You didn't have to do this, I know, but I wanted to." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I've implemented new intake procedures at my firm. We now require clients to disclose any video evidence of incidents they're claiming, and we independently verify key facts before filing." What happened with Patricia taught me an important lesson about due diligence. After he left, I sat back down on my porch with the check in my hand. It was an unexpected ending to an already strange story. I deposited the check the next day and donated half of it to a local legal aid organization. It seemed appropriate somehow, using money from this mess to help people who actually needed legal assistance. Summer arrived, green and humid, and life continued its forward march. The house where Patricia had lived was purchased by a young couple with twin toddlers. They were friendly, waving whenever they saw me, and their kids loved to play in the yard. It was a complete transformation from the judgmental surveillance Patricia had conducted from that same property. I ran into Deborah at the grocery store one afternoon in July. She'd resigned from her interim HOA position after Tom was elected, and she looked almost relieved to be free of the responsibility. "I wanted to apologize," she said when she recognized me in the produce section. "I knew Patricia was pushing you around, and I went along with it because it was easier than standing up to her. That was wrong." "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, and I did. It took courage to admit you'd been complicit in someone else's bad behavior. "She called me, Patricia, about a month ago. She's living somewhere in New Hampshire now, working as a receptionist at a dentist's office. She wanted to know if the new HOA board would write her a character reference letter." "You're kidding." "I'm not. She genuinely doesn't understand why people are upset with her. She thinks she was unfairly targeted because she held people accountable as HOA president. I told her there was no way anyone from Pine Ridge would write that letter, and she hung up on me." We talked for a few more minutes before going our separate ways, and I found myself feeling something almost like pity for Patricia. To be so disconnected from reality, so unable to see how your own actions caused your downfall, that seemed like its own kind of prison. The video of Patricia's crash had taken on a life of its own online. Someone had leaked it, probably one of the court staff, and it had gone viral on social media under titles like "HOA Karen deliberately crashes car" and "When fraud backfires." I'd received interview requests from local news stations and even a couple of national outlets, but I declined them all. I'd gotten my justice in court. I didn't need to turn Patricia into a nationwide joke, even if she'd brought it on herself. That August marked 1 year since the trial. I was working in my home office when I got an email notification from the Vermont Attorney General's office. It was a form letter informing me that Patricia Henderson's probation had been modified. She'd violated the terms by failing to complete her community service hours on schedule, and had been given an extension with a warning that any further violations would result in jail time. I closed the email without responding. It wasn't my problem anymore. Patricia's consequences were hers to deal with, and I'd moved on with my life. The Pine Ridge Community Association held its annual meeting in September, and I actually attended this time. Under Tom's leadership, the meeting was efficient and focused on real issues like the need for road repairs and the proposal to update the community playground. There were no vindictive enforcement actions discussed, no petty complaints about grass height or visible trash cans. It was what an HOA meeting should be: neighbors working together to maintain and improve their shared community. When the meeting ended, several people came up to thank me for standing up to Patricia. "You took the hits so the rest of us didn't have to," one man said. "She would have kept getting worse if someone hadn't finally called her out." I accepted the thanks graciously, but the truth was simpler than that. I hadn't stood up to Patricia as some act of community heroism. I just refused to be bullied, and I defended myself when she escalated. The fact that it resulted in broader change was almost accidental. That October, I got a letter from the Vermont State Bar Association. They were investigating Martin Whitmore based on his representation of Patricia and wanted to know if I'd be willing to provide a statement. I declined. Martin had apologized personally and had made changes to his practice. Ruining his career seemed excessive when he'd been misled by his own client. The first snow of the season came in early November, just a dusting that melted by noon. I stood at my living room window watching it fall, remembering the events that had started almost 2 years earlier with a similar snowfall. It felt like a lifetime ago now, all that stress and anger and uncertainty. When the big storms hit in December, I was ready. I'd upgraded my snowblower to a more powerful model, and I'd installed additional exterior cameras with better night vision. Not because I expected another Patricia, but because I'd learned the value of documentation. I cleared my driveway with the same efficient pattern, piling the snow neatly along my property line. The snowbank grew with each storm, 4 feet high, then 5, then 6. Nobody crashed into it. On Christmas Eve, the neighborhood had a progressive dinner party, something Tom had organized to build community spirit. I went, bringing a homemade lasagna, and found myself actually enjoying my neighbor's company. We ate, we talked, we laughed. At one house, someone brought up the Patricia situation, and the room fell briefly silent. "Ancient history," I said, raising my glass of wine. "Here's to new beginnings and better leadership." Everyone drank to that, and the conversation moved on to more pleasant topics. As I walked home that night, snow crunching under my boots and Christmas lights twinkling on every house, I felt genuinely content. My neighborhood was a good place to live now. My home was mine, without the shadow of an HOA tyrant hanging over every decision. Justice had been served, not just for me but for everyone Patricia had bullied over the years. The sign at the edge of my property, the one warning people not to crash into my snowbank, had become something of a neighborhood landmark. Kids giggled at it. Adults took selfies with it. It was a reminder that sometimes the absurd things in life deserve to be laughed at rather than feared. Spring came again, as it always does, melting the snow and revealing the brown grass underneath. I took down the sign and stored it in my garage, ready for next winter. The flower beds I'd planted the previous year bloomed with color, and the water feature burbled peacefully in the afternoon sun. I was sitting on my porch in late April when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 30s got out, looking nervous. She introduced herself as Helen Brooks, and she'd just purchased a home in a different HOA community across town. "I heard about what happened to you," Helen said. "With Patricia Henderson and the lawsuit. I'm having similar problems with my HOA president, and I wanted to ask your advice." We talked for over an hour. I told her about documentation, about knowing her rights, about the importance of responding to violations in writing with specific references to the governing documents. I told her about cameras and surveys and the value of having evidence. Most importantly, I told her not to be intimidated. People like Patricia derive their power from the fear they inspire, I explained. The moment you stop being afraid and start demanding they follow their own rules, their power evaporates. It might get worse before it gets better, but standing your ground is worth it. Helen left with a notebook full of advice and a new determination in her eyes. I hoped her situation would resolve more easily than mine had, but if it didn't, at least she'd be prepared. As the seasons continued to cycle, my life found a comfortable rhythm. Work was good, my home was a sanctuary, and the community around me felt genuinely supportive rather than oppressive. I dated occasionally, traveled when I could, and generally enjoyed the life I'd built. The story of Patricia and the snowbank became a tale I'd tell at parties, edited down to its most absurd elements for maximum comedic effect. People loved it. The image of someone deliberately crashing their car just to create a lawsuit was so ridiculous that it always got laughs. I'd show the video sometimes, and people would watch in disbelief as Patricia's Lexus methodically drove into the snow. What was she thinking? Someone always asked. She wasn't, I'd reply. That was the problem. 2 years after the trial, Tom informed the HOA that he was stepping down as president. He'd taken a job in Seattle and would be moving. An election was held, and I was surprised when several people nominated me. I declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime, but I appreciated the gesture. They elected Mrs. Chen instead, and she proved to be a warm and sensible leader. Life had a funny way of working out. What had started as Patricia's attempt to destroy me had ended up destroying her instead, while simultaneously freeing an entire neighborhood from her tyrannical leadership. Sometimes justice worked exactly as it should. I still live in that house on the corner lot in Pine Ridge. My snowbanks still pile high every winter, always neat, always entirely on my property. I've never received another violation notice, never faced another lawsuit, never had another run-in with an HOA board member who couldn't handle the fact that I knew my rights. The sign stays in my garage most of the year, but every December, I put it back out. It makes me smile every time I see it, a small monument to one of the strangest chapters of my life. Sometimes neighbors will point it out to visitors, and I'll hear them telling the story, usually with details that have gotten exaggerated over time. That's fine. Let the story grow in the telling. At its core, it's a reminder that bullies eventually face consequences, that documentation matters, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be a victim. Patricia Henderson crashed into my snowbank and tried to sue me for the privilege. Instead, she lost everything. And me. I won my case, won my peace, and learned that standing your ground is always worth it, even when it's difficult, even when it's scary, even when it seems easier to just give in, especially then. The snow will fall again this winter, and I'll be out there with my snowblower, creating the same neat banks along my property line. If Patricia's story taught me anything, it's that doing the right thing and documenting everything will always see you through. The video that showed the truth became the evidence that set me free, and somewhere in New Hampshire, Patricia is probably still convinced she was the victim in all this. Some people never learn, but that's not my problem anymore. I have a life to live, a home to enjoy, and neighbors who have become genuine friends. That's the real victory, not just winning in court, but reclaiming the peace that Patricia tried so hard to take away. The judge dismissed her case when he saw the video, and justice was served. But the real satisfaction came from watching a community transform from fearful compliance to empowered cooperation. That's Patricia's true legacy, not the fraud conviction or the viral video, but the positive change that came from people finally saying enough is enough. And it all started with a pile of snow,